I'm Cheryl Lanker. I'm the EQB Vice President and Speaker Coordinator, and we would like to extend a very warm welcome to renowned C.S. Lewis scholar Dr. Harry Lee Poe and our own University of the South Professor Emeritus of History, Dr. W. Brown Patterson, and they will be presenting the C.S. Lewis I Knew. As a Rhodes Scholar from 1953 through 55, Dr. Patterson studied English and literature at the Magdalen College, Oxford, where C.S. Lewis was a fellow and served as Dr. Patterson's tutor. In his presentation today, Dr. Patterson will connect his remembrances as a college student at the University of the South with his experience studying under C.S. Lewis. Dr. Patterson's talk appears in C.S. Lewis Personal Reflections, which is in that book that Dr. Harry Poe will hold up. And Dr. Patterson's talk appears as C.S. Lewis Personal Reflections and C.S. Lewis Remembered, edited by Dr. Harry Lee Poe and Rebecca Whitten Poe. Dr. Harry Lee Poe has graciously offered to provide us with an introduction today and to assist us with our question and answer session at the end of today's presentation. Dr. Poe is the Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, where he has taught a course on C.S. Lewis for over 20 years. Dr. Poe has published and lectured widely on the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. With his latest publication, The Completion of Lewis from War to Joy, and that's those 3 books, Dr. Poe has completed a trilogy on the life of C.S. Lewis, so EQB wants to extend a warm welcome to these very distinguished scholars. So without further ado, here they are.
Well, I'm very honored to be here and to be in such good company, and I look forward to the observations that Harry Lee Poe has to say, and he is a distinguished scholar, has published many things, including now 3 volumes on C.S. Lewis, and he's finally gotten up to the period that I knew more about than most people, at least in a personal sense. So it's called The C.S. Lewis I Knew. I had the privilege of studying at Oxford, reading English, as the Oxford vernacular has it, under the eminent writer and scholar C.S. Lewis. This was no accident. When I was a senior at the University of the South, Charles Harrison, my advisor, told me that 2 of the leading scholars of the English Renaissance were Douglas Bush at Harvard and C.S. Lewis at Oxford. He encouraged me to think that I would have a chance if I applied for the scholarship to Harvard or Oxford for further study. As it happened, I had the privilege of going to both universities and of studying under both men. In 1952-53, I was at Harvard under an American Council of Learned Societies first-year graduate fellowship, and I studied under not only the people that had been recommended, but many others at Harvard, and had a very good experience. In 1952-53, I was at Harvard. At Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, studying under Lewis at Magdalen College. My essay in connection with my Rhodes application made a case for going to Oxford for precisely this purpose. I said that I wanted to have tutorials with the author of The Allegory of Love, a study in medieval tradition, because he was a literary scholar who dealt with writers and texts in their historical and cultural setting. I also said I wanted to study under a man whose views on the importance of religion and moral values were very consonant with, but more highly developed than, my own. C.S. Lewis is widely known for three major accomplishments: his Christian apologetics in the form of broadcast talks and various books in the course of World War II, and during the post-war period made him one of the best-known writers on Christian subjects of that time. His children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, reached a vast audience and continues to appeal to hundreds, perhaps thousands, of children and their parents. His scholarship in medieval and Renaissance literature made him one of the preeminent literary historians and critics in this field. There are also books, articles, and various literary contributions that do not fit neatly into these categories. His prose fiction for adults, namely Out of the Silent Planet, Pilgrim's Regress, Until We Have Faces, continue to find many readers and are treated as significant works by critics. He also published a fascinating spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, a number of poems, and various critical articles. A considerable number of books drawn from papers that Lewis left on his death in 1963 have been published posthumously. For 2 years, or rather for most of 2 years, I had a weekly hour-long tutorial with Mr. Lewis, as he was called, and during the time that he was a stipendiary fellow and tutor in English language and literature at Magdalen College. He and his colleague, J.A.W. Bennett, also a distinguished medievalist, each had me for an hour a week. Under their guidance, I wrote essays on broad subjects based on primary texts which they assigned, with whatever help I could get from the lectures given up the street in the examination schools or in various colleges, including nearby Balliol, Merton, and New College. Lectures at Oxford, which were announced each term in a thick folio-sized schedule, were strictly voluntary. No attendance was taken, nor were tests administered. The whole focus of my week's work, especially the night before my tutorial, was on the essay. My essay was, in fact, the main item on the agenda for each of these tutorials. It is hard to imagine a system more exactly opposite to the prevailing one in American colleges and universities. Instead of listening to a professor lecture for an hour at a time, 3 times a week, and later trying to remember as much as possible about what he or she had said when it came time for a test or examination, the emphasis at Oxford was on the student and the development of his or her ideas. The first thing that happened in a tutorial with Lewis was that I would read my essay on a broad topic like Shakespeare's tragedies or Donne's love poems or Swift's Gulliver's Travels. My tutor's head, indeed much of the small sitting room where we sat, would be wreathed in the smoke from his pipe, so it would be hard to know what he was thinking. He would interrupt frequently to ask me to read a sentence again or to expound on a point further. Finally, after the period it had taken me to read my composition, he would begin his critique. He could quote back to me sentences I had just read. When he commented on for style as well as content, I once used the term fortuitously to mean fortunately. He reminded me that it meant by chance. And he convinced me that we, should not let the word change its meaning to something for which there was already a perfectly good word. He would agree or disagree as he thought best, but in all his criticisms, he sought to lead me to strengthen an argument, to express an idea more clearly, or to anticipate a difficulty. All of this was aimed at improving my way of understanding the texts and expressing my point of view. Unless I asked him directly, he would not elaborate on his own views, let alone try to impose them on me. An approving word from Lewis, as came, for example, in a session on 16th century English tragedy, was something that made my efforts seem entirely worthwhile. I was very much aware that I was presenting my half-baked ideas to a world-class scholar, and as a result, I tried to advance an argument that was as tenable and persuasive as possible. I ventured on this occasion to suggest that a tragedy in Elizabethan England had a different quality from the tragedies of ancient Greece, partly because Christians thought of death, at least for the faithful, as an entry into larger life. The ancients seemed to have no such hope, with the result that death seemed as stark and fearful as could be possibly imagined. We talked about several plays of Shakespeare and Sophocles, and he seemed surprisingly taken with my distinction. One thing he did not like was an argument or an expression that was pretentious or too technical. I once adapted a term paper I had written at Harvard and used it for my tutorial essay. It was full of definitions and critical terms like symbolism, myth, analogy, and it included quotations from critics, including Lewis himself. He did not like it at all. He much preferred a paper which developed 2 or 3 ideas with quotations from the literary texts themselves and which hardly contained any reference to secondary sources. The tutorial has seemed to me ever since an ideal way to teach. The student has to take the initiative, master the texts, present the ideas, and then refine them in the light of the comments of an established scholar. Also, there's nothing like having to write one's ideas down and read them aloud before a person that you would want to convince in order to improve one's literary skills. After 2 or 3 terms in Oxford, I wrote a several-page-long letter to Charles Harrison at Sewanee, proposing that the entire curriculum at my alma mater be converted to the tutorial system. He was, by then, dean of the college, and I know from his reply, which he gave to my letter, and he passed it on to Edward McCready, the vice chancellor. Needless to say, the entire curriculum was not changed. But it happened that the Brown Foundation Tutorial Fellowship was instituted a few years later to bring outstanding scholars to Sewanee for stays of up to a semester, and a junior tutorial, a small seminar to be taken in the junior year, requiring a weekly essay of every student, became a part of the major in the history department. One of my hopes in going to Oxford was to be able to discuss with Lewis the religious and moral questions of the kind he had advanced so provocatively in the books that he had written, some of which I had discovered as a teenager at Vade Mecum, the church camp I attended in North Carolina. These books included Christian Behavior, Beyond Personality. He was happy to do so in the weekly sessions we had, as long as the questions were related to the subject of the week. He was very down-to-earth, commonsensical about such questions. He took Christian tradition and the scriptures very seriously. He also felt strongly that certain ideas and values could only be understood with reference to what he called a standard way, which virtually all civilizations agreed on. This was, as I came to understand, a natural law point of view. He had little time for theologians who were urgently trying to be responsive to changes in society and knowledge, in which later came to be called a trendy way. His was a Platonic point of view, that the basic human search was for ideas and values that were eternal. To call him the most successful of mid-20th century apologists for the Christian faith is to state a truth, but it also states a paradox. He specifically rejected the apologist's usual technique of stating the Christian faith in times appropriate to the culture of its age. What he aimed at doing was to present the agreed upon doctrine of Christian tradition in such language and using images intelligible to ordinary people. His examples were often strikingly homely, suggesting he was a keen observer of how people actually lived. It seems appropriate that his own conversion to a belief in God was while he was deep in thought during a ride on a double-decker bus ascending Headington Hill in Oxford. I have ridden the descendants of this bus many times during sabbatical leaves in Oxford, and I cannot imagine a more mundane, sacred place. During my second year at Oxford, when incidentally I lived on a staircase in new buildings only a few yards away from the rooms in which my tutor spent his days, Lewis accepted the position of Professor of Medieval and Renaissance English Literature at Cambridge University. But he did not move to Cambridge at once. In fact, he never moved his permanent residence from Headington Quarry in Oxford. He simply spent several days a week in Cambridge, where he lectured, supervised graduate students, and resided as a fellow at the Cambridge Magdalen, spelled with a final E. Fortunately for me and his other students at Magdalen, Oxford, he continued to give us tutorials for the Michaelmas and Hilary terms, the three terms at Oxford: Michaelmas, Hilary, and Trinity. He encouraged me when I showed an interest in going to theological seminary, and he wrote a letter of recommendation for me to the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I entered in the fall of 1955. The experience of studying at Oxford under C.S. Lewis was important to me in days I came to understand more fully as the years. Thinking through literary, moral, and religious questions helped me to sort out my own ideas and values. Receiving his criticisms and advice certainly helped me to become a more effective writer. More than anything else, the conversations that gave me confidence were those I had with him. I remember spending half an hour with Lewis and a friend and benefactor of mine from the United States, Kenneth I. Brown, Executive Director of the Danforth Foundation, who were partially supporting my graduate efforts. I've sometimes found myself trying to explain why the University of the South, which then had an enrollment of about 500 students, all men, calling itself a university, I chose to argue that the undergraduate program at Sewanee was based on the course of studies at the medieval universities, which had their roots in antiquity and were constantly being revived and revised as a subject of the ongoing investigations of contemporary scholars. I said it was this kind of education that John Henry Newman had described in his great work, The Idea of a University. I have read Newman's book in preparation for a debate at Sewanee on the value of a liberal arts education. Lewis liked my argument. He did not actually agree, but he said enough to show that he took what I said seriously. I can picture Mr. Lewis easily as I first saw him. He was out for a walk along the college water walks by the Charwell River. He was wearing baggy trousers, corduroy I think, and a shapeless tweed jacket over a loosely fitting sweater. On his head was an old tweed hat with its brim turned down. His shoes were heavy brogues. I identified him, to myself of course, as one of the gardeners. This was my second mistake of the day. The first was in thinking that the neatly dressed, tall, handsome person in the porter's lodge was the president of the college. It turned out he was the head porter. Beneath Lewis's bluff, hearty, and inelegant appearance was, as I found out, a man of unconscious and uncommon intelligence, vast enthusiasm for books and learning, and a deep, sometimes mystical devotion to the God he had come to know. As it happened, my own career did not follow the course Lewis and I both assumed it would. Instead of returning to Harvard after my 2 years at Oxford to continue working towards a PhD in English there, I enrolled for a BD degree at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about the Bible, the biblical languages of Hebrew and Greek, the history of the Christian church, and Christian theology. After 3 years of study, followed by ordination in the Episcopal Church, I went back to the Harvard Graduate School for a PhD in an interdisciplinary program called History and Philosophy of Religion. My graduate courses were mostly in history, and I had as my thesis advisor the historian W.K. Jordan, who wrote extensively on the spread of religious toleration in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. As a scholar, I found my vocation to investigate the ways in which religion and politics, as well as other in parts of the culture, were related in early modern Britain and Europe. Not all of the subjects I have researched and written about are likely to have been of interest to him, but they all, I think, illustrate a point frequently made by Lewis in his lectures and tutorials. That is, that no one can understand adequately the men and women of medieval and Renaissance Europe without a firm knowledge of the Christian ideas that pervaded the culture of those centuries. As a teacher, I have found that the surest way to lead students to a knowledge of the past and of its significance is to get them to write essays and research papers dealing with historical events, persons, texts, and ideas. By writing, they gain ownership of some part of the subjects they read about and hear discussed. I tried to teach students to write effective compositions in large part because it enabled them to think clearly and critically and to retain what they had learned through their own efforts. C.S. Lewis seems to me to have had three distinguishing characteristics. as a writer, teacher, and Christian theologian. 1. Doggedness. Lewis apparently upheld the ideas and values he believed in. He stubbornly resisted Christianity before his conversion. Afterwards, he was just as stubborn and persistent in its defense. What he defended, moreover, was no fashionable or trendy version. It was the solid heart of the matter. He defended his critical ideas about English literature in the same way. 2. Imaginativeness. Lewis had a vivid, almost powerful imagination, which he harnessed to interpret the sometimes strange, exotic, remote territory of the European Middle Ages, and to create the lands of Narnia and the extraterrestrial life of his science fiction. His Christian faith became the organizing principle of much of the work, and he defined Christianity with great skill. But his faith at bottom was the faith of a poet, a storyteller, a magician in words. He was, of course, from Ireland himself, and he had a keen appreciation of its autocracy, its customs, and its society. 3. Humanity. In everything he wrote, Lewis was deeply aware of how ordinary people lived, what they thought about, and what they were looking for in life. This is what makes his Christian writing so accessible and so influential. Lewis was not an aristocrat, nor was he an intellectual snob. He never liked the role of a celebrity. He could talk to you or me in our everyday language and understand us. Late in his life, after my time in Oxford, his humanity seems to have been further advanced by the love he had for Joy, the American whom he married, shared in life with one another. Lewis was able to be a friend to thousands during his lifetime by his teaching, his lecturing, and his extensive correspondence, as he still does through the many books he wrote. To use his own term, he was a mere Christian.
Well, I'm going to pick it up there for a few minutes, and first of all, I'd like to put in context some of what was going on with C.S. Lewis when Brown was visiting him every week at his rooms. It was an important time for Lewis. He had been taking care of a lady from the end of World War I until 1951. She was the mother of a friend of his, and they had an agreement. If one of them died, the one who survived would take care of the parents. And so Lewis dutifully took care of Mrs. Moore for 30 years. And she became more difficult with every passing day. I'm beginning to appreciate that myself. I'm trying to become more difficult for my daughters, and I'm succeeding, I think. But, and it was a huge burden that lifted when she died. And, you know, it's a terrible thing to think, but she really was a terrible person. And that happened just before, just a couple of years before Brown arrived in Oxford. Now, Brown mentioned some books that he read at Episcopal camp, these little slim volumes that were the radio talks. And he gave the names of those slim volumes that most of us have never heard of. Because in 1952, he took those three little volumes and he edited them and put them together in one volume called Mere Christianity. And so this is the American version. So that had just come out just before Brown arrived in Oxford. And in 1954, Lewis published his volume on English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. He wasn't going to get into Shakespeare. That would have taken 3 more volumes. But he'd been working on this monster for 15 years, and he hated it. It just went on and on and on, but he finally finished it to rave reviews. I mean, he was, at this point, he was highly respected as a literary critic and scholar, and also greatly despised by many of his literary enemies, particularly over in Cambridge, and who didn't like his approach to dealing with the text. They wanted to deal with everything else but the text. But anyway, so this had just come out. It was a massive, monumental piece of work. And he'd been working on these little things. Work is probably the wrong word. These are the Chronicles of Narnia.
Oh.
And I think in 54 and 55, The Horse and His Boy and The Magician's Nephew came out. So those had been in process. And finally, Brown mentioned his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which came out in 1955. So all of this very important production was what Lewis was doing while Brown was writing his essays every week. And there was one other thing I wanted to show you that is a tie-in. Here's an issue of the Sewanee Review. Have you ever heard of it? Okay. And in autumn of 1955, Lewis contributed an article to the Sewanee Review. Now, my story is that my very good friend Brown Patterson is responsible for it being here. And since I have the microphone, you can't argue with me. But that's my story. And I'm sticking to it. One last thing, Brown mentioned that Lewis left Oxford and went to Cambridge, only he didn't quite leave Oxford, but he sort of went to Cambridge. When he went to Cambridge and accepted the professorship, the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature, he delivered a lecture, this famous lecture. Of course, it's in Latin, or the title, De Descriptione Temporum. It's a fascinating lecture in which you talked about imagination and creativity. That wasn't just with his Narnia stories. Every great scholar employs imagination, because it's with imagination that we see relationships. You don't get that with calculation. It's imagination allows us to see and understand what others miss. And he talked about the fact that one of his bugaboos was the idea that the Renaissance never really happened. And you say, what? And by that he meant that there wasn't a sudden rebirth of civilization. It had been going on for centuries. And now, I don't think any historian would disagree with him. That's the standard line now. They don't say C.S. Lewis taught me this, but C.S. Lewis taught them this. But this, the 13th century is sometimes referred to as the Magnificent Century. It was the century of Magna Carta. It was the century of Thomas Aquinas. It was the century of St. Francis, and art was beginning to shift as Western Europe rediscovered Thomas Aquinas and his emphasis on the particular and the here and now and the observable universe, as opposed to Plato, who was concerned with the eternal and the other world. And so icons are representative. They're not an attempt to be an accurate reflection of human forms. They're more symbolic. But with Aristotle, you're concerned with the actual world as you see it, and art began to reflect that. So Lewis was concerned with this sweep of time, this gradual change over time, and he said that time doesn't really have boundaries, landmarks that stand up and say, well, this is the end of the Middle Ages and this is the beginning of the modern period. That doesn't exist. But he did say, but I think there is a division of time, that something has happened since the time of Jane Austen. And Jane Austen was one of his favorite writers. He adored Jane Austen. He discovered her as a teenager. And his friend, Lord David Cecil, who was one of the Inklings, was president of the Jane Austen Society. In fact, if you've ever seen a Jane Austen movie, anybody seen a Jane Austen movie? David Cecil, Lord David Cecil, is really responsible in many ways for the revival of interest in Jane Austen in the 20th century. But anyway, Lewis was a great lover of Jane Austen, and he says, something's happened since Jane Austen. And it's the role of the machine. Now, Lewis was quite prescient. Can we say that? Is that a word?
Prescient, yes.
He understood 2023 better than most of us do. And he was describing in that essay the sort of thing that might happen if we become, in some sense addicted to our machines, dominated by our machines. But anyway, all of this was going on when Brown was going every week to read his essay and to get a critical response. So that's the first thing, the setting of things going on with Lewis. And as you listen to Brown, you may have heard him say quite a few times in the course of his essay, his concern for values and morals. Did you hear him say that? I mean, there was the religion and the theology in there, but the values and the morals have to do with the application of one's faith. And there's what we believe, but then there's how then do we live as a result of what we believe. This was a critical element in Lewis's conversion to Christianity. Lewis's mother died of cancer when he was 9 years old, and like many people, he was asking the question, if there's a good, all-powerful, loving God, then why did my mother die? It's a very important question. I would suppose that of all the people in this room, all the people have asked a question like that at one time or another. It is an important question. Well, so that was the beginning of his dismissal of Christianity. Well, there is no God. A loving God wouldn't have let my mother die. A lot of people reach that conclusion. This question was the question that drove the Buddha. It was the question that drove Charles Darwin. His daughter died. It was a question that drove our cousin Edgar George. Everybody he loved died, and so it's a universal question. Most people, though, don't ask the other questions. They sort of leave it at that. And as you grew up and went away to boarding school and studied Latin, and the Latin teacher explained about the mythologies, these are just stories that people made up to explain natural phenomenon. And he said, okay, the Romans and the Greeks did that. So did the Hebrews. So the Bible is just a collection of stories people made up to explain natural phenomena. And he then thus dismissed God. Then to literature. He was a washout at school, boarding school, the English public school. His father and brother feared that he might grow up to become an axe murderer. He was antisocial. He was just a complete misfit and a pretty obnoxious little boy. He was smart, but he was terrible at sports. And if you're terrible at sports in an English public school, well, in an American school, doesn't matter, then your life has no validity. And so he fought back by being an intellectual snob, because he did that well. He did the brains part well. But his father finally decided, I'm going to take him out of school and place him with my old schoolmaster, who'd now retired to Sussex and was taking in one boy a year to sort of keep his hand in and make a little extra money. So he went to live with Deputy Kirkpatrick, who was a confirmed atheist, materialist, but a brilliant man in logic. And Kirkpatrick taught Lewis to think. And so during the day, he would read Greek and do his lessons, but at night, he did his pleasure reading. And in his pleasure reading, he discovered the medieval romances. And he discovered one particular story that charmed him most. He fell in love with this story. It's the journey story, where you travel to the end of the world for the great thing, and you risk everything to achieve the great thing, to win the great prize, whatever it is. He discovered the story first with William Morris's tale, The Well at the World's End. So we went to the end of the world. Along the way, you have to rescue the damsel in distress. And when you return, you're a different person. That is, the journey itself has changed you. You're not the same anymore. And this story just hit him deeply. And he kept finding it over and over again. He found it with the quest for the Holy Grail, Mallory's Le Mort d'Arthur. He found it in Spencer's The Faerie Queen. And he found it over and over and over. And this story, though, entranced him so because of the values involved in it. And he loved these values so much, and yet they weren't real because they weren't physical objects. And for a materialist, nothing's good or bad, things just are. Nothing's beautiful or ugly, things just are. Because values are non-physical. And in a physical universe where nothing exists except the physical, the non-physical doesn't exist. Only it did. And this was the beginning of the crack in Lewis's atheism and materialism. He finally had to admit, though there really are values, and they're not physical, so they've got to come from somewhere else. And this is that universal, that the way that he talks about in The Abolition of Man, the Tao, and he talks about it in a number of different ways and a number of different stories. But that then became the driving impulse in his spiritual autobiography that he wrote, Surprised by Joy. But for me, I have done several things on Lewis. The first one is this book that Brown contributed to. It's a collection of essays by former students of Lewis. And my concern was, we know Lewis so much for being this major Christian apologist and and had an influence on millions of people. But that's not what he did for a living. He was an English teacher. And did he really have any impact, any influence, any lasting contribution to his discipline? And so that was what the driving question behind this little book. And I ferreted out a number of his former pupils, he would have said, not students, but pupils. And all, they made extraordinary contributions in their disciplines. Y'all all know Brett Patterson, dean of the college, who snuck in a tutorial into the Sewanee history curriculum. But Derek Brewer, the master of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, would have been one. And on. There's just lots of people that made contributions. This little book, it's a coffee table book, not a work of great scholarship, but it's a memory book to illustrate the magic of Oxford itself, the atmosphere of Oxford, the places. There's something about a place, and oddly enough, this is one such place. In the Oxford Alumni Magazine, golly, 20 years ago, maybe longer ago than that, there was an article about the other Oxfords. And in that article, in the Oxford Alumni Magazine, they talk about 4 other colleges on the planet that would be akin to Oxford. One of them is Sewanee. And so they had a nice, there's something about the atmosphere. But anyway, that's what that book's about. And then these 3 volumes, biography of Lewis, that just came out, this finished up last year, the 3rd volume came out. And that's how Brown and I got to know each other. He wrote a little article in the Sewanee Alumni Magazine about his time in tutorials with Lewis. My cousin George sent me a copy of it, and that was when I thought, you know, I ought to collect up these stories. And that was the beginning of it. That was the beginning of that little book. I had a ruptured disc halfway through editing it, and I thought, oh, well, I'll be flat on my back for 6 weeks. I'll get all this work done. Only I didn't. And that's the point at which I enlisted my then 16-year-old daughter to finish the editing. And she did a splendid job. She's now a professor at Baylor University. But that was her beginning. And got to know Brown. Well, now, let's open it up now and see if you don't have some questions, particularly of Brown, just now. And I'll see if I can moderate here. Who has one? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, Dr. Patterson, in your tutorials, did you have to rewrite your essays and have them look at them again or not?
No, he didn't want to even have a copy of it. He figured he'd done his part, and I agreed with that. But I treasured those essays because they reflected my conversations with him as well as my own conclusions, and I took it as a sign of great modesty on his part that he didn't say I was dead wrong. He would accept what I wrote and deal with it that way. And yes, thank you.
Yes, you.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. Did he have a minimum word requirement?
Well, not exactly, but it would take me up to, say, 20 minutes to read what I had. And so that was, you know, those are pretty good lengths, I think.
Yeah. Once a week?
Yeah, once a week, exactly.
Yes, in the back.
I understand he was a prolific letter writer, and I just wondered if, after you worked with him, Dr. Patterson, did you ever have opportunity to correspond with him, and do you have any of his correspondence?
Well, no, I didn't, and I regret to say that, but I was very busy when I left and at theological school, and then I got into graduate study at Harvard, and wound up at Davidson College, which I was very glad to do. And the fall I was at Davidson, he died. Same month that John F. Kennedy died. Yeah.
Someone else? Yes.
I know Lewis had a lot to say about F.R. Leavitt's and I.A. Richards and his works. Did you ever have an opportunity to meet them, or did Lewis speak about them in his lectures?
Well, and he didn't have me or any of his other tutees to his house, as far as I know. But I certainly met other members of the family. His older brother, Warney, had an office at Magdalen College as well, and he would be in the next room sometimes. And so I had some knowledge of the family, and but also I came to know his own spiritual journey as he had experienced it, and it was so abrupt. It was between 19 the end. Well, it resolved itself in about 1931, and it was during that period that he took that famous bus ride up the to the top of the hill, and I was joking in a way that it's hard for me to imagine myself doing that, but it was his experience certainly. In other words, he was never satisfied unless he had his doubts resolved, and before that, in 1929, he had not. In 1931, he had. So that's one of the appealing things about Lewis. He was resolute.
Someone else?
Will
Yes.
you tell us, Dr. Patterson, one of the reading assignments that he gave you? Do you
Well, yeah, they were on those broad subjects, some of which I mentioned, like all of Shakespeare's tragedies, for example. That's a lot of reading for 1 week. And you've got to make the choices, the student, that is, I'm saying, about what was really important, or what was, changed the way we think about certain things, and that's what he wanted you to bring out. And if you missed it, he wasn't going to tell you the answer.
I have one, Brown.
Yeah.
You were there at that critical period. He was leaving Oxford, going to Cambridge. He had a new girlfriend. Joy Davidman moved to Oxford only when he moved to Cambridge. So she didn't move to Oxford. She was living in London. She didn't go up to Oxford until he was no longer in Oxford, except on the weekends. But during that period, was he doing his lectures still at Oxford? Did you get to hear any of his lectures?
Here's the thing. He was splitting his time. He was devoting his Mondays to his former students, and the rest of the week he was devoting it to Cambridge because they were paying his salary after all. But he wasn't going to abandon us. This was the thing. And it wasn't until the third term of that second year that I didn't have him as a tutor. That's one semester right at the end, the Trinity term, that I was assigned to have tutorials with a scholar at Merton College. And, that probably was an important phase in my life, but nevertheless, I missed him very much.
What day of the week, do you remember what day of the week you had your tutorial?
Well, I don't exactly. I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday, it was the middle of the week. But what we're talking about now was it was pushed back to the
Monday?
to the first, for the first Monday.
Okay.
Because if you had to get on to Cambridge, it was the rest of the week.
So that Monday morning, let me just throw something in here from my research. So rather than go back to Cambridge on Sunday evening, he waited until Monday because he had an obligation that he was going to meet, and he had a deep sense of duty. And the duty is sitting here in this chair next to me. And when he was negotiating the move, and originally he turned down the chair when it was offered to him because he had obligations in Oxford. The first obligation was his brother, Warney, who was alcoholic and needed Lewis there. His second obligation was Paxford the gardener, that if Lewis left Oxford, Paxford would lose his job, and I think he had the sense that Paxford probably would not be able to get another job. The third obligation was he had these research students, and I don't know how many other than you. He wouldn't have had many.
No, I was not a research student.
Yeah.
I was somebody learning the basics, as it were.
Yeah, but you were a Rhodes
A
Scholar.
Rhodes Scholar, yeah.
Yeah. He was only a Rhodes Scholar. Excuse me.
But could I just interrupt to say one more thing? There was in those days a train that went from Oxford to Cambridge, and that made it all possible because he could finish his day tutoring his students, so what in some ways were former students, and getting on the train and still.
And that's if you want to learn more about that, that's a wonderful book to read about that affair.
Another book that goes into it in detail is The Completion of C.S. Lewis by Hal Poe. You'll find it all explained there for you.
I'm sorry to cut this short, but we need to vacate the room now. We're about a half an hour over, which is okay, but we can't push it much more than that. But they have graciously offered that they will be out in this front meeting area. So if you have further questions, you're welcome to go out there and address your questions to them. And there are a variety of books that both Dr. Poe and Dr. Patterson have brought for you to leisurely look at. And then, of course, I believe all of your gentlemen's books are available on Amazon. Is that correct? So if you're interested in any of these books, you can get them on Amazon. I got mine there, and I'm going to have mine signed today while they're here. So anyway, if you have a book you'd like to get signed, I bet you could talk them into doing that. So I also want to especially thank Lucy Patterson Murray for helping with this. Lucy, could you stand up just for a minute? She's been so helpful in getting this all together. This is one of Brown's beautiful daughters. And so she was the one that was able to get Dr. Hal Poe to come over and enlighten us. And Dr. Brown Patterson, we can't thank you enough. This has been such a special occasion. So everyone, thank you so very much for coming. We really appreciate it.